Yá'át'ééh, bene. Good morning, my relatives. Today is Thursday, August 1st, believe it or not, August 1st of 2024. And I am sitting down with my second cup of coffee. It's a hot cup, even though it's a warm day in Washington, D.C. today, but I'm drinking a hot cup of coffee. And today I want to have a discussion with you, both about a book I've been reading, as well as about just some eye-opening revelations it's been giving to me about my own life, as well as about the world that's going on around us. And so the title of this episode is Sleep, Politics, Power, and Naps. And the book that I've been reading is called Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. I'm going to share some resources by him, and I want to have a discussion about how reading this book has helped me understand not only more about myself, but about the world that I'm living in, especially the public world of people in power and people in politics. So grab a cup of whatever your favorite morning beverage is and pull up a chair and let's have a discussion. So before I begin, I want to do like I always do and acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C., the traditional land of the Piscataway. I want to honor the Piscataway as the hosts of the lands where I'm living. I want to thank the Piscataway for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. So there's a lot going on, and there's so many paths we could go down. And I'm going to go talk about the presidential election right now with both Vice President Harris as well as former President Donald Trump. I'm also going to talk about some of the antics recently of Elon Musk, but there's a lot of other things I can talk about. As you know, some of the detainees of 9/11 in Guantanamo Bay just agreed to plead guilty in exchange for life in prison. And I struggle to see that as good news because we tortured them. And I don't necessarily know what a guilty plea means when you torture somebody. And it's humiliating for us as a nation to have gotten a guilty plea through a prolonged series of torture where we held them for who knows how long, years, decades, without even charging them, just held them indefinitely in a location where we could treat them basically with impunity. And so, yeah, I struggle to know how to respond to that. So I'm not going to go into depth about that today. I'm also, there's a lot of other things going on right now. Governor Newsom in California just signed a law trying to encourage the moving of unhoused peoples out of these homeless camps and more into some kind of transitional housing. And that is being viewed both as positive and negative, depending on what side of the political coin you're looking at. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things that could very easily be discussed. But this past week, I've been reading a book, and this book has opened my eyes up to A, my own health, and B, it's opened my eyes up to just see differently or give me a new paradigm on the world that I'm living in, especially the public world around politics and around power. The book I've been reading is this book by Matthew Walker. It's called Why We Sleep. I highly recommend this book. Matthew Walker is a sleep scientist. He references a lot of different studies on sleep and just lays out some very convincing and an overwhelming amount of evidence about not only the way sleep is beneficial for our bodies and the things that it does for us, but also how detrimental being sleep deprived can be for us. And it's caused me actually to take a really hard look at my own life and my own sleep. Now, I've known for a while I don't sleep enough. I've known, right? If you've heard me talk about even for the past 2 decades, I've been watching the sunrise every morning, and I've been getting up many mornings around 5, sometime between 5 and 6, depending on what time of the year it was and when the sun was rising. And I'm also an extrovert, and I stay up late at night almost by default. And so I would be going to bed anytime between 11:30 and 12:30 or 1, and then waking up again sometime between 5 and 6. And so for the past several decades, I've been surviving on somewhere between 5 and 6 hours of sleep a night, maybe even a little less than that on several nights. And I was functioning, I was working, I was writing. I did not feel sleep deprived. I knew I needed to sleep more. I knew I wasn't getting the enough sleep for my long term health, but I wasn't doing anything really serious about it. And then it was maybe 2 years ago, I decided I really need to get more serious about getting more sleep. And if you've noticed, even on my social media, I began watching the sunrise less than I had been. I began sleeping a little bit more. I had risen my average up to about 5.5 hours of sleep a night a year ago, around the time I had my hip surgery. And over the past year, I had risen it up another half hour to about 6 hours of sleep a night. Um, and then I read this book, and I started reading this book about 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago. And literally over the past 2 weeks, I've added an additional half hour to 45 minutes to my sleep at night. I'm now sleeping between 6.5 and 6 hours and 45 minutes a night. And I'm working hard to get my sleep even higher. That's how convinced I have been by this book I've been reading, and I want to share that with you. So I recommend the book. The book, again, is called Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. And then if you don't have time to read the book, I'm going to share a few resources with you about the book a little bit later in the podcast. But before we go deeper into that, first let me see who's on. I haven't even checked who's logged on this morning and joined me. Joe, Yá'át'ééh, thanks for joining me. Actually, it's no longer Yá'át'ééh. It's afternoon, about 12:08 here in Washington, but many other people around the country are still in their morning hours. And so thank you, Joe, for joining me. I know there's others out there, so thank you for sitting down and enjoying a cup of coffee with me this morning. So anyway, if you follow the news at all, especially political news, you know that yesterday, well, these past several weeks, past week or so, week and a half, has been really difficult for the Trump campaign. Since Joe Biden dropped out and Vice President Harris has kind of seized the reins of becoming the most likely nominee for the Democratic Party. The news stories have all been in her favor. The polls are beginning to swing her way. She's raised over $200 million in the past week alone, in the first week of her campaign, right? There's just been this massive shift. And the Trump campaign and Donald Trump specifically have been bothered by this and trying to figure out how to get the attention back on Donald, right? Donald, again, he displays many symptoms of classic narcissism and needs to be the center of attention. And they've been working hard about how can they get the focus again off of someone else and back on him. And so there's been a lot of debate within the Trump campaign about how to do this. And one of the decisions they made, according to articles I've read, is that they were going to focus on policy. They were going to hit Kamala Harris on her left-wing kind of liberal background. They were going to hit her on the border. They were going to hit her on some law enforcement issues. And they were really going to try to work hard to reframe the conversation around policy with Vice President Harris. And I want to share this article with you. It was in Politico. It ran this morning, I think. It's titled, "Trump and His Allies Had a Plan for How to Hit Harris. Then He Opened His Mouth." And if you heard about the interview that he did yesterday with the Black Journalists Organization, I forget the exact name of it, he literally just grabbed headlines while simultaneously putting his foot in his mouth. And he refused to answer questions. He began to question Kamala Harris's Black identity. He began to just kind of espouse these really radical and offensive thoughts. One of the paragraphs in the story, it says, during a 34-minute question and answer, which was supposed to be an hour, that interview was scheduled for an hour, his campaign cut it short. But during a 34-minute question and answer appearance before the National Association of Black Journalists, that's the name of the organization, Trump questioned Harris's Black identity. He said he would pardon violent January 6 rioters, And he didn't directly answer when asked if his vice presidential pick, Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, would be ready to assume the presidency should anything happen to him. In analyzing this, they said they don't have a narrative that they're comfortable with about how to take down Harris, said Chuck Coughlin, an Arizona-based political strategist. He's grasping around. I think he's desperately grasping around with his instincts. I don't think his team has any way to put a handle on this. So he's instinctively grasping around for what to say. And right, that interview, by any measure, was an absolute mess, both politically as well as just demographically, with women, with people of color, because of the things he said and the things that he kind of brought into that. And so it was really seen as a very negative thing. And on one hand, right, you can look at this and say, well, that's just Trump being Trump. Now, I want to share with you another story that came out, and this was a few months ago, but I saw the headline yesterday. And this is a story in AP News about how Musk abruptly canceled the Don Lemon show, a contract that his CEO of X had negotiated. And Elon Musk went on the show. This was back in March, and the interview did not go well. It was very testy, just like Trump's interview with the National Association of Black Journalists. And it didn't go well. And after the show, Elon Musk canceled Lemon's contract with X. From this story on AP, it says, in the clip, Lemon asked Musk if he believed that he and the social platform held any responsibility to moderate hate speech on X. He singled out the spread of the Great Replacement theory, a racist belief that in its most extreme form falsely contends that Jews are behind a plot to diminish the influence of white people in the U.S. Musk replied sharply that he doesn't have to answer questions from reporters. The only reason I'm in this interview is because you're on the X platform and you asked for it, he said. Otherwise, I would not be doing this interview. When Lemon followed up with a question about the criticism Musk has to face over the issue of hate speech, the CEO replied, I'm criticized constantly. I could care less. And after the interview, I forget how soon after, he canceled Lemon's contract with X. Now, both Elon Musk and Donald Trump are known for their kind of very abrupt, non-thought-out responses to things that are confrontational for them. They end up being hurtful in many ways, and they're very abrupt in the way they do things, and they don't show they're thinking long-term about stuff. And on one hand, we've just come to tell ourselves, well, that's Donald being Donald, or that's Elon being Elon, right? That's just the way we are. And sometimes that's the price you pay for. Some people may call it genius, other people may call it success, whatever you want to label it. Right? They've reached a pinnacle or a point of power, a point of wealth and prosperity, and so they're viewed by many as reached some sort of point of very practical or attainable success. Now I want to get back to the book I read on sleep. And I'm going to share two resources with you. First of all, I highly recommend the book Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. But second, here's a TED Talk he gave a few years ago. It has, I think, 20 million views. And I invite you to listen to this TED Talk. And then there is a podcast I found that he was on. Now, I need to warn you, I haven't yet listened to the podcast, but as I was looking through the show notes for the podcast, it brought up all the points I had read in the book. And so the show notes for the podcast had many of the points that were in the book that I wanted to highlight anyway. And so I thought this podcast is about an hour in length. I encourage you to listen to it. If it's based on what the show notes are about, it should cover many of the things that I'm talking about in this. But in his book, and apparently in the podcast, the Science of Success podcast, The Truth About Sleep and How It Can Save Your Life with Dr. Matthew Walker, There are several points that Dr. Matthew Walker makes in his book and in the podcast. The first one of them is, after being awake for 24 hours, you're cognitively as impaired as someone who is legally drunk. Second, when you have an underslept employee, someone who's sleeping less than 6 to 7 hours or less than 7 hours a night, some of the characteristics of underslept employees is they produce fewer creative solutions. They are more likely to lie, cheat, and engage in deviant behavior. Other things about sleep deprivation is there's appetite, weight, and food consumption are all regulated by sleep, and a lack of sleep makes you eat 300 to 550 more calories per day, and it causes you to crave more high sugar and high carb foods. And the book, it doesn't just list these out. It talks about studies that were done. It talks about what sleep does for you, both mentally, emotionally, physically. And it's a really, really, really good book. And then it shows how detrimental being sleep deprived is. And it talks about one of the things it suggested is that we allow ourselves a sleep opportunity of 7.5 to 8 hours or 7.5 to 9 hours a night, like giving yourself 7.5 to 9 hours to be in bed and to be asleep. Talked about ways to prep for your sleep, talk about ways to kind of maximize your sleep, things that can deter from your sleep, so on and so forth. And the book was so compelling to me, I decided to start implementing it immediately. 2 days ago, or 3 days ago, 2 days ago, once I kind of made it through the bulk of the book, I literally started going to bed about 45 minutes to an hour earlier than I was even half a year ago. I'm now trying to get in bed before 11 every night, where before I would be lucky if I could be in bed before midnight. And now I'm getting to bed before 11 every night. I'm sleeping until 6:45. And so I'm giving myself easy 7.5 to 8 hours of in bed time, and I'm sleeping. And so as I've watched, I look back over my Fitbit app and my sleep tracker on my Google Watch. And over the past year, I saw my sleep rise from about 5.5 hours a night to 6 hours a night, just this past month. And literally in the past week, or past 3 weeks, I've seen my sleep rise, or 2 weeks, sorry. The past 2 weeks, when I implemented these newest changes, I saw my sleep rise from 6 hours a night to 6.5 to even 6 hours and 45 minutes of sleep per night. And then I also read a chapter on the benefits of napping. And it talked about how when you take a nap, and naps should be less than 60 minutes in length, so to prevent you from going into a deep sleep, and they should take place at least 6 hours before you go to bed at night, because it takes about 6 to 7 hours for the sleep pressure in your body to build up to make you sleepy again. And so they said, if you're going to nap, and they said for people who are struggling with sleep, or they have insomnia, or they're not sleeping well at night, they suggested not taking naps. But they said one way to even improve your cognitive function throughout the day is to take a nap. And what that does is it literally files some of your learnings and your memories and the stuff that you were on your mind in the morning. It files them more permanently into your brain, so you have a fresh sponge of a brain to get more knowledge and more experiences and more understanding in the afternoon. And again, it was so convincing. I read that in the book. I actually listened to a few podcasts. I decided to try it. I just want to try it. And I couldn't believe how well it worked. And so now, not only am I sleeping 6.5 hours a night and climbing, but I'm now napping for about a half hour to 45 minutes in the afternoon each day. And that's giving me a greater, it's almost like my most productive time in the day for all of my life has always been the early mornings, about an hour to an hour and a half after I wake up. That's my most productive time. And I'm beginning to feel that same level of alertness and productivity now in the afternoon after I wake up from a nap. And so again, my thoughts on sleep are completely transforming, right? Where so much of our culture tells us that sleep is for the weak, and right, and people have always said, well, we'll sleep when we're dead. And right. I mean, there's this whole mentality of sleep is for the weak and you're not supposed to get sleep. And that's absolutely not true. Sleep is something, it's a biological need that we need in our bodies. And we need to be working hard to do what we can to get the sleep that we need. And when we don't get that sleep, it has huge detrimental effects on our cognitive capacity, on our emotions, on our actions, on our so many other ways. And so what's fascinating is, right, as we look at the impulsive behavior of both Donald Trump and Elon Musk, as we look at the ways that they act when they're confronted or they have confrontation in the way, right, and these aren't the first times they've done these things in these interviews, right, where they act very rashly, very abruptly, very even cruelly, and very impulsively. And this is what we call just Trump being Trump or Elon being Elon. But many of these actions are the result of being sleep deprived, right? I mean, they're literally acting out the things that in his book Matthew Walker lays out of. These are some of the symptoms of being sleep deprived, and we see them clearly on display. And when you look at the amount of sleep that both Donald Trump and Elon Musk are getting, right? It's not actually very surprising. There's many articles and even statements by Trump where he talks about, I think he sleeps. He says he sleeps 3 to 5 hours a night, right? He goes to bed around 1 or 2 a.m. and wakes up at 5 a.m. And he operates on 3 to 5 hours of sleep a night. Elon Musk, right, also does not sleep very much at night, and he has a very he does not sleep very much. And I had an article here on Elon Musk, and I think I might have lost it. Shoot, I will put it in the show notes. But there's another article around Elon Musk. It's by Inc., the website Inc., I think it was. And in that article, I'll make sure I'll put this in the show notes. But it talked about how a lot of his impulsive behaviors, he's blamed on his lack of sleep. And he says he's sleeping 6 hours a night. But he says he used to be working, he now works 80 hours a week, and he used to be working 120 hours or even more per week. And even talked about, other challenges he's had with sleeping, or even saying he doesn't sleep very much at all. And what's fascinating is this is what we hold in highest regard, right? This is what we hold as this is what it looks like to be successful. And we kind of stare in wonder at these people who have attained some level of success, and yet they brag about how little they sleep. In the article on Sleep Advisor that talked about Donald Trump, it also talks about how much sleep other presidents have gotten. It said President Obama got 5 hours or so of sleep a night. He was notorious for staying up late, working until 1 or 2 a.m. and waking up again at 6 a.m. Bill Clinton also got 6 hours or less of sleep a night. George Bush got between 8 and 9 hours of sleep a night. And he would go to sleep between 9 and 10 and wake up around 6 a.m. And he was very, very intentional about making sure he got enough sleep. And so I found that all to be really fascinating, especially because if you do have a chance to read the book Why We Sleep, at the end of the book, I think it's the final chapter, he talks about 2 examples of major catastrophes that probably could have been avoided. I think one was an oil spill and a crash at sea, and the other was a nuclear accident, that both were most likely caused by the operators being sleep deprived and not getting enough sleep. And so, right, when you think about how important sleep is, and you think about how much better we function when we sleep, and then we look at our leaders and see how little sleep they're getting. Right, even President Biden, right? He blamed his horrible debate performance on a lack of sleep, and he said, "I need to sleep more. I have to start shutting down my public appearances after 8 p.m. so I can actually get to bed," because he was most likely burning the candle at both ends, staying up late and working late and getting up early. And as we see, right, it's the exception of the world leaders, the U.S. presidents who sleep long. Many of them sleep very short nights. I also found an article about Vice President Harris, and this was an article from about 2020, and it's from a blog that's called A Day in the Life, and it looks at a day in the life of different people of fame. And they did a day in the life of Kamala Harris. There's other people they've done a day in the life of, and it gives kind of their daily schedule along with their how much they sleep, if they have that information. And what's fascinating, I want to just show you this. This is Kamala Harris's daily schedule. This is according to 2020, where she would be up by 6 a.m. doing a spin class, or also doing some other kind of. The point is, she's doing exercise by 6 a.m. And then she goes throughout her day. She unwinds in the evening. She kind of winds herself down, which is good. That's all good prep for a good night of sleep. And then she's in bed around midnight. And so she's getting about 6 hours of sleep, but she's not working right up until she goes to bed. She actually winds herself down in the evenings, which is something that's really good to do. And it talks about how she's really intentional to get good exercise and to eat healthy. So she's sleeping probably a fairly solid 6 hours per night, based on at least what she's reporting here. But again, this is still subprime. This is still less than what we need. And so I just find it really interesting. She is probably getting more sleep than most of the other people that we looked at. Even with Bill Clinton, who said he got 6 hours of sleep a night, he was notorious, apparently, for being awake till 1 or 2 a.m. and literally calling his aides in the middle of the night and asking them to work on something or look at something. So not only was his sleep disrupted, but the sleep of the people who were working for him was also severely disrupted. So then I want to end, and this article caught me, and this isn't necessarily about sleep, but I want to take the tone of the first article I shared about Donald Trump, and the way he's really looking for a way to both get the attention back on himself and to attack Vice President Harris as she's campaigning to be president of the United States. And there was this other article that was in the New York Times yesterday. And I saw this and took some time to read it. And it says, when it comes to Trump, Harris tries a sunnier tone. And it talks about how in her campaign, in contrast to Joe Biden, who continuously kind of treated Donald Trump as this ominous threat to our democracy and to the world that we know and the world that we live in. And it was all this really dark kind of stuff, right? And that wasn't just in 2024. It was also in 2020. And Vice President Harris is actually treating him a little bit different, and she's taking a more lighter approach, and she's basically saying some of these attacks against me are just plain weird, and she's kind of calling out Donald for what he's doing and what he's saying in an attempt to kind of bring him back down to size, right? Bring him back down and not let him be even this omnipresent, ominous threat, but he's just someone else who's running, who has some very different ideas than what many people are thinking or want to do. And I've noticed that in some of the campaign speeches I've seen her give, and some of the clips I've seen. They pointed out really well in this article. And It said, and one of the things it said in this article, I'm just going to read this to you. It says that one of his final events as a presidential candidate this month in Detroit, Biden described the Capitol riots on January 6, 2021 in detail before revoking a potential second term for the former president in frightening terms. Trump is even more dangerous now. No, I'm serious. He's unhinged. He snapped, Biden told the crowd. He says if he loses, there will be a bloodbath. Eric Wilson, a Republican strategist, said stroking the fear of Trump was the best option for a fundamentally unpopular candidate. There weren't people who were excited to vote for Joe Biden again, Wilson said. And so the Biden campaign took a very ominous threat of and treated Trump as a very ominous threat. Whereas Harris offers a whole, now she's a woman of color, right? Running for the highest office in her land. There is a lot of potential for change and hope in her campaign. And she's trying to capitalize on that instead of just another moderate white landowning male from the upper echelons of the 1% running to be president again, right? And so there's really this extreme change in tone between the two campaigns. And I'm actually really excited about that. I think that is one of the ways to campaign well against Donald Trump. Donald Trump loves when the attention is on him, either positive or negative. I mean, that's one of the symptoms of narcissism. And he presents many of the classic symptoms of someone who has narcissism. And they want the attention, whether it's either positive or negative. And for her to basically diminish him and bring him down to earthly levels instead of this ominous level of both a threat or the savior, right? I mean, it's really amazing how the Democrats during the Joe Biden campaign was seeing Trump as this ominous threat to everything we hold dear, and conservatives were seeing him as the savior of everything that they hold dear, right? There were these two radical extremes, but they were both really, really, really powerful, which I think is where Donald Trump likes to be. And so for the Harris campaign to say, no, he's just someone else who's running, who says some pretty weird things and does some pretty weird things and advocates for some pretty unpopular policies. And she brings him back down to earth. And I think that's a brilliant way to campaign towards Donald Trump. So I'm actually really interested to see how that strategy continues to work out. I'm really interested to see what's going to happen with that campaign, with her campaign over these next few months. And I really hope that someone on her campaign staff makes sure that she continues to prioritize her health and her sleep. As she gets busier, as she gets more well-known, as the pressures get even higher than they were as vice president, I hope that she is able to not diminish her sleep, but even grow it as she goes through this campaign. And that could end up being the difference, right? That could literally, when you have someone who's been well-rested, who's thinking clearly, who's thinking very straightforward, campaigning against someone who is not, that could be a very big difference in the race. So anyway, my relatives, those are some of my thoughts. Thoughts about sleep, thoughts about politics, thoughts about power, and thoughts about naps. And I have to confess, I am in the middle of transitioning from being someone who was not convinced of all the benefits of sleep to someone who is so convinced. I'm actively testing them and trying to figure out how I can get more sleep into my body every day. And the more I've done that, the better it's been for my well-being, for my emotional health, for my physical health, and for my mental health. And so my relatives, I want to thank you for joining me for a cup of coffee this morning. I hope your cup is as good as mine. And if you are interested in partnering with me to help keep my voice as independent as possible, one of the things I do on my social media is I don't monetize it. I don't monetize my YouTube channel. I don't monetize my Twitter or Instagram accounts, because I don't want to give advertisers any influence over what I say or what I don't say. And so I do have a Patreon site where you can subscribe to me on Patreon. There's many levels you can subscribe to, all the way from $5 up to much higher. And it's a great way to go deeper into the conversation with me, as well as to help keep my voice independent. And so I'm going to put my Patreon link here in the chat, and I welcome you to think about subscribing to me on Patreon. And there's a lot of different ways that you can connect with me there. So, of course, you can also purchase signed copies of Unselling Truths, the book that I co-authored with Soong-Chan Rah, and you can buy those books on my website, which also help take the conversation even deeper. So, my relatives, I hope these things are helpful for you. Let me look through the comments to see who else is in here. Shantina, Yá'át'ééh, thank you for joining me today. Susan, Yá'át'ééh Bina, thanks for joining with me. Andrea, thank you for being here today. I appreciate everyone's participation in this discussion. My relatives, have a good day. Walk in beauty. And may we all learn how to walk in beauty together. And Hakonet.